First of all, I want to apologise profusely for everybody that I'm not actually with you in person. It would be much nicer to be able to see you close up rather than as fuzzy images here. I'm just waving to one of my colleagues now that they've got things up and running. And I'm sure all of you have been pretty much transfixed by, or maybe not transfixed, but certainly hearing about the news from Boston. And as Brian and Renee will tell you, for my sins, I'm one of the few experts on Chechnya in the United States. And my phone has been ringing off the hook since I did not get on the plane to Syracuse. So the day has become more complex than I was anticipating. But one way or another, the day actually points to Mr. Putin. So it's actually probably a good day to be talking about Mr. Putin operative in the Kremlin, because one of the major points of Mr. Putin's rise to the presidency in Russia in 1999-2000 was the war in Chechnya, which was a major factor around the time of his presidency. By the time he became prime minister in 1999, the second war in Chechnya was underway, and today we seem to be talking in the context of Boston about some of that aftermath. So by a very strange set of circumstances, some of the issues I was going to touch on today are more current than we might have anticipated. Brian, do you have the first slide up? Because I'm afraid I can't see from here with the title page of Operative in the Kremlin.
Got the front page now.
You do? Okay, very good, thanks. So what I wanted to talk about first of all is why write this book. So I wrote this book with my colleague Clifford Gaddy, who is an economist. And Cliff has been looking at the Russian economy for decades, in fact, since the Soviet period. And the two of us wrote a book exactly 10 years ago on Siberia. This one was a bit more interesting to write, it must be said. But it was really kind of looking at the legacy of the Soviet economy and trying to explain why Russia really had not developed in the way that we anticipated. And when it came to Mr. Putin, the two of us have been, basically in the whole time that we've been working together here at Brookings, that goes back to 2001, we've been dealing one way or another with Mr. Putin and trying to figure out the phenomenon of really this rather remarkable individual in many respects. Putin, the factoid that most of us have about him was that he was a KGB officer for 15 plus years. He was also the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg for a period of time in the 1990s. And then he suddenly appears on the national scene in Russia, seemingly out of the blue. And it's really hard to explain why is it that someone like this, someone from the shadows, someone from what the Turks call the deep state, so from the very unaccountable institutions that were never open to public scrutiny, should suddenly vault to the top of the Russian state in the 1990s. You have to go back an awfully long way, and not even in a Russian context, probably to ancient Rome and Byzantium and maybe the Italian city-states, to find someone from the Praetorian Guard, someone from behind the scenes in this clandestine manner, becoming the emperor, becoming the person in charge. And so this is why we wanted to set out and try to figure out who is Mr. Putin. That question was posed in 2000 when he first became president, and no one has really satisfactorily answered it. If you move on to the next slide there, Brian, with the title, Who is Mr. Putin? You variously see here that there have been a lot of biographies written about Putin. So again, why write another one? And in one of the most recent by Masha Gessen, he's called the man without a face. He's the man who can appear to be anybody to anyone at all. He appears, in various different guises. We know that Putin has spent an awful long time, in fact, hiding and concealing many parts of his biography. But if you think back to the front cover of the book with all those Mr. Putins in a suit, as a deep sea diver, as a basically a race car driver, an ice hockey player, somebody who's engaged in judo. The man's done everything and continues to do everything. He's been the ultimate political performance artist. Other world leaders would be embarrassed being seen in so many different costumes, doing so many different things, but not Mr. Putin. He can pretty much be anything that the occasion basically demands here. And the question is, why does he do that? He basically, in many respects, assumes these different personalities, these different political personas to engage with a certain constituency, to make a political point. He's actually said that. Masha Gessen, who was the author of that last biography I referenced, she is part of the Russian opposition. She's an American-Russian journalist who's been living in Moscow for a long time. She's now, in fact, the new producer and director of Radio Liberty. And she was actually called up by Putin on her mobile phone and told to come to the Kremlin because she'd actually been sacked from her position as the editor-in-chief of a Russian nature magazine because she wouldn't send out a reporter to cover Mr. Putin flying with cranes. Remember that, when he's in the microlight, dressed up in white, pretending to be a crane, leading the cranes back on their migration path? Well, anyway, Masha was told by Mr. Putin when she actually showed up in the Kremlin that in fact he'd thought of this up. We used to think that other people came up with these ideas from his vast PR staff, but he said no, he did this because he wanted to make a point. He thought that people should be paying more attention to conservation. So he wanted to make a big statement himself by flying with the cranes to get people to understand that there was a bigger purpose here. And so we decided, look, to take this idea of these various fake guises, these political performances of Mr. Putin, and try to address here if he's assumed these identities for a purpose. Maybe there's some way that we can actually get to his real identity. Because as I said, so many parts of Mr. Putin's biography are unverifiable. There's lots of rumor and innuendo about key parts of his life. We don't really know whether he ever really left the KGB, although he claims that he did in the 1990s. There's been lots of speculation that his rise to the top was part of a KGB plot to put one of their own, an operative in the Kremlin. We pick up on that idea in the title. So we decided to approach the book by trying to see if we could come up with some real identities of Mr. Putin as a device to try to tell us something about Putin and also about Russia itself, the Russia in which Mr. Putin operates, and why it is that Putin has been, for really 12 years, until he decided to come back into the presidency, one of the most popular and effective Russian political figures. Now, part of that is because there's not much else in the way of political competition, but it's also because Putin has resonated in many respects with a vast swathe of the Russian population. Now, we know in 2011 and 2012 that this foundered somewhat, that there were protests against his re-election, and that as we've seen over the subsequent year, not everyone has been very satisfied with Mr. Putin, and his popularity has really dropped. His electoral results were not what he expected. But up until, I would say, 2010, 2011, Putin still really resonated with the vast majority of people in Russia. And why is that? So we've looked at what we know, at least in the broadest terms, about his biography. We know he was born in the 1950s, so and went to Leningrad State University as a student studying law in the 1970s. So we went back and looked at what the Soviet Union was like in this period, what it might have been like being at Leningrad State University in the 1970s. There's a surprising number of people, especially in the United States, who were exchange students then. We even found someone who danced with Mr. Putin at a discotheque, or so she claimed. So we basically, looked for all kinds of people who could give us some kind of insight into Leningrad State University in the 70s, and did they or did they not meet Mr. Putin then? We did find some people who do remember him for a variety of reasons then. Then we looked at the KGB in the 1970s. In the mid-70s, when Putin joined the KGB, it's a very specific period in the KGB under Yuri Andropov, who then went on to become the General Secretary of the Communist Party and leader of the Soviet Union. And this was a period when Andropov was trying to figure out how to deal with the dissident movement in the Soviet Union. He had actually been the ambassador, the Soviet ambassador to Hungary in the 1950s when there was the Hungarian uprising in 1956. And he'd also been in charge of relations with the rest of the communist world in the 1960s during the Prague Spring of 1968. And then he was dealing with the movement at home of the dissidents, of people who were trying to change the Soviet system. And he wanted to then refresh the KGB and bring in a new group of people who could really try to come up with fresh ideas of how to handle that. So there's actually a lot of information about the KGB in the 1970s when Mr. Putin joins, and I'll talk about that again in a minute. And then we looked at the 1980s when Putin in the KGB was posted over, well, it wasn't overseas because it's over land, but abroad to East Germany and to Dresden. And again, there's a lot of information about what Dresden was like in the period in which Putin was there from 1985 to 1990. So I'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on through the presentation. And then the 1990s in St. Petersburg, when Putin comes back and is actually assigned by the KGB to work with Anatoly Sobchak, his whole law professor from Leningrad State University, who becomes the first democratically elected mayor of St. Petersburg. And Putin eventually becomes his deputy mayor. and becomes in charge of businesses that are being set up in the city of St. Petersburg. Now, Renee and Brian both spent over a year in St. Petersburg and can tell us a little bit more about what it is like today, which is a bit different from the wild 1990s of Mr. Putin, but it was a very specific time and place. And then, of course, it's been much more well documented, Putin's positions in Moscow in the 1990s and into the 2000s. And we spent an awful lot of time looking at the various pronouncements that Mr. Putin has made and what he's been doing in office. So as a result of that, we came up with what we're calling 6 real identities of Mr. Putin. And, you can debate on how real you think they are. But what they do is they tell us something about Putin as a political figure. The first 3 in particular I'm going to talk about are identities that we could really use to describe a whole host of Russian political figures, and I'm being very careful about saying political figures rather than politicians, because ultimately Putin is not a politician. Again, he rose out of these deep state institutions. He never ran for elected office before he was appointed to become the successor to Boris Yeltsin. But they could be ascribed to a whole group of people from his generation, from his age group. And then there are 3 identities I'm going to talk about are much more specific to Putin himself. So Brian, if you move on to the next slide, the statist. Some of these pictures have been rather randomly selected here. This is a picture of Mr. Putin saving the country during the peat bog fires that you may remember from a couple of years ago, when it seemed that all of Russia was on fire and Moscow was engulfed by this pall of choking smoke. There were massive demands for more response from the authorities, and Mr. Putin gets into a firefighting airplane and drops water down over some of the worst of the fires. Now, anybody who knows something about peat, and I do because I'm originally from Scotland, land of peat bogs, you can't just put out peat bog fires like that. But nonetheless, it was a dramatic gesture. Putin, the political performance artist, and Putin basically going out there to, in his relished role as the saviour of the state. And so this is the first identity of the statist. When Putin is selected to be Boris Yeltsin's replacement in 1999 to 2000, it comes at the end of what's been a decade of upheaval and economic and political collapse for the Russian Federation. So in that first decade, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia becoming an independent state, we go through turmoil, we go through the war, the first war in Chechnya, that of course is very much now in the headlines as a result of the developments in Boston. We go through periods of deep humiliation on the international stage, with wars in the Balkans where Russia is not consulted. You remember the really indignant Russian reaction to the bombings of Belgrade in the late 1990s and to the NATO intervention. Russian forces are pushed out of the Baltic states. On the economic front, there's utter collapse of the economic system, huge inflation, massive debts, and Russia defaults on its debts and devalues the ruble in 1998. So Putin comes in at the end of all this at a period where Boris Yeltsin has lost all of the political authority that he had. His popularity was in the single digits. He was in terrible health. Many of you may recall he literally died in between the electoral rounds of the 1996 presidential elections and was revived, having had massive heart attack and then open heart surgery in this period, all of which was pretty much concealed from the public, although it was pretty obvious that something was wrong with him. So basically there's a consensus across the board, across the full political spectrum in Russia, that something has to be done, that order has to be restored. Now there is a debate about how order should be restored and for what purposes. The reformists around Boris Yeltsin want order to be restored to the governance, to the institutions of the state, to the apparatus of the presidency, to the various ministries, to give them more clout and enable them to move on with the path of reform that they've been undertaking, the radical economic and political reforms since the beginning of the 1990s. There are others to which it becomes clear that Mr. Putin belongs to that have a more conservative view, and I use that in the kind of classic consensus, or the classic view of a conservative, that kind of going back to basic values that we would think of as conservatism in any setting. But in the Russian context, that means a return to the fundamentals of Russian history, to Russian tradition, to Russian culture. Putin espouses putting the Russian Orthodox Church back to its central place in Russian social and spiritual life, although not making it the state church. He talks about the revival of traditional Russian values. These are not Soviet values, but Russian values dating back to the Tsarist period of communalism and, again, family values, all the kinds of things that we would, again, ascribe to a classic conservative politician. And these kinds of ideas he lays out in his first major speech as acting president, and they all come from a body of work that many others ascribe to, including Gennady Zyuganov, the head of the Communist Party, who is constantly one of Putin's political opponents, and a whole host of cultural and other political figures in that rather conservative part of the Russian spectrum, including the very famous Russian film director Mikhalkov. Many of you will have seen his films, Burnt by the Sun, which won the Foreign Language Oscar, for example. So Putin is very identifiable in a group of people who have a very conservative view of the Russian state and want to see the Russian state back on its feet domestically and internationally, back as being one of the great powers. So that's the first identity of a statist, and it's something that Putin actually calls himself. He calls himself a statist, a государственник in the Russian tense, right at the beginning of his political ascendancy. This leads us on to the next identity, the history man, which is in the next slide. And I have to admit that I just very shamelessly picked this picture because I just love Putin in this hat. You might remember that recently President Obama was out and about and somebody asked him to put a hat or a helmet on, and President Obama said, rule of politics 101, never wear a funny hat because you'll never look good in it. And I guess we can argue, does Putin look good or not in that hat? But you've got to give it to him. That's one hell of a hat. And I just love that picture. And I wish I personally had that hat. And we can probably find pictures of Renee and Brian wearing hats like that in their time in St. Petersburg. We would ask Brian if he's got a hat like that. In any case, the hat underscores the fact that Russia, historically, traditionally, is always a cold place, and that cold plays a very important part in the Russian imagination. And that particular picture is taken out in Siberia. It's a still from a documentary that was made by a German TV company called Ich Putin, I Putin. And it's really showing Putin sitting around thinking deep thoughts about Russia and Russia's history and Russia's future. And Putin always makes a point about Russian history. So at the very beginning of saying he was a государственник, a statist, he has put Russian history right back in the center of things. He describes himself as a student of Russian history, specifically Russian history. He doesn't seem to read a lot about the history of other places. He spends a lot of time, so he says, reading histories of Russia, the biographies of great Russian leaders, the Tsars and other historical figures. And he frequently, throughout his presidency and his period of being prime minister, has invoked the legacies of historical figures. The reformist Tsars, Peter the Great, no surprise, coming from St. Petersburg or Leningrad, Catherine the Great, Alexander II, all the great reformers, Nicholas I, who is often seen in a very different light on the outside, but certainly someone who was very concerned about Russia's legacy, Russia's role as a great power. Of course, didn't have the greatest of reigns as Tsar, because he came in on the back of the Decembrist revolt of 1825 and went out on the back of the Crimean War, which were not exactly two high points in Russian imperial history. But nonetheless, these are people that Putin points out as really the standard bearers of reforms that he himself is now carrying on into the present. And he made his announcement that he was going to return to the presidency from being prime minister for those 4 years, from 2008 to 2012, in September of 2011. And the reason that he picked that particular time was because this was the 100th anniversary of the assassination of Pyotr Stolypin, who was the great reformist prime minister and the last really significant prime minister of the Tsarist era, the prime minister under the last of the Romanov Tsars of Nicholas II. And Stolypin had a great plan and programme of reform, social reform, economic reform, political reform. He was the first prime minister who operated within an elected parliament, the Russian Duma, which has now been revived in its current form in the Russian parliament. The same name has been revived. And it was Stolypin who really was the father, of many respects, of Russian parliamentary democracy. And when Putin stepped away from the presidency for 4 years, he said that's what he was going to do too. He was going to revitalise the prime ministership and the parliament by stepping into this role. Now, of course, he stepped into that role for 4 years because he was prohibited by the constitution from having more than two consecutive terms as president. So in many respects, to preserve the integrity of the presidency, he had to step away. But he announces that he's coming back to complete the reforms that he started off on the anniversary of Stolypin's assassination. So everything was freighted with historical symbolism. And Putin has frequently taken the George Orwell tack of he who controls the past also controls the future. History has been a tool for political purposes throughout the whole of President Putin's time in office. I want to move on now to the next of the three identities that describe Putin himself, of the survivalist. Now, obviously, the picture is a survivalist in some of the conventional terms that we talk about here. And this also comes out of Putin's reading of Russian history and his own personal perspective of Russian history. Putin is the child of survivors of one of the blackest periods in Soviet history, of the siege of Leningrad in World War II. He talks about that frequently. It's documented that his parents went through the siege of Leningrad. He's also their only surviving child because they lost two children, certainly one that we know of during the siege of Leningrad. We don't know about the circumstance of the other. And his father is also a survivor in some other rather strange ways. He was in a battalion run by the NKVD, which is one of the forerunners of the KGB, the secret police, that was sent behind enemy lines in World War II into what is actually now modern-day Estonia, to basically carry out a scorched earth policy to shoot collaborators, Estonians, who were collaborating in the view of the Soviet military with the Nazi forces, and also to blow up bridges, roads, and get rid of other significant installations that could have been used by the Nazis. This was usually a suicide mission. People very rarely came back from it. But Putin's father did. Sorry, I keep having to have glasses of water here, but it's a bit dry in this room. Anyway, Putin talks about this history of survival, of coming out of Leningrad, and of having shaped his own view. And why we pick the title of survivalist is a survivalist is someone who builds on that experience and tries to prepare for the worst possible outcomes, to think about contingencies. And what Putin has done since he came into the presidency is build up the state's material reserves to withstand any crisis. Most of you are very familiar with the survival techniques of the average Russian, growing potatoes and other staple crops on their garden plots to see them through the winter or through hard times. Well, what Putin did when he came into the presidency was he really built up, in an extraordinary measure, the national state reserves of Russia that had been started off by Stalin in the 1930s, when basically the Soviet Union felt itself under siege from the outside and wanted to make sure it had enough reserves to fall back on if it wasn't able to basically trade externally. So these reserves are of everything from fuel oil to fertilizer to medicines to tents to generators, baby food, soldiers' boots, I mean, you name it, those were in the reserves. And those had been depleted in the 1990s under Yeltsin. And in fact, they'd often been plundered for sale for bringing in hard currency at some of the darkest times, especially at a regional level. And Putin made a point of building these back up again, in his view, so that Russia could withstand any future war, natural disaster. So that's one mark of the survivalist. The other thing that Putin did was pay off Russia's colossal national debt. I mentioned the collapse of the ruble in 1998 and Russia's default on the debt. And what Putin did was he benefited greatly from the increase in world oil prices as he came into office from the 2000s onwards. And he made it a special point to pay off Russia's debt. He probably has a pretty scathing view of our own inability right now not to be able to pay off our debts, because he really believed that this was at the root of Russia's humiliation internationally. The country wasn't solvent and therefore it wasn't sovereign. It wasn't able to make its own decisions. It had to basically turn to its debtors, and it could easily be forced to do things that it didn't want to do. Putin remembers that in 1994, the last of the Soviet military in the Baltic states were forced out because the Russian government desperately needed loans from the World Bank to shore up its coal industry and many other issues. And so Putin wanted to make sure that something like that could never happen again. And using his survivalist instincts, he paid off the debts. And of course, he did this in association with a number of other key people around him, most notably Alexei Kudrin, who was his long-serving finance minister, another colleague of his from St. Petersburg. He also has built up Russia's currency reserves so that they have one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. And given the volatility of currency, he's invested very heavily in gold. So Putin has been very circumspect about figuring out how the country can put itself into good stead for the future. So moving for these three major identities to the last three, which are more specific to Putin, and then I'd like to have more of a conversation with you. And as I said, we can talk about anything you really want to here after I've just laid out the broad parameters of the book. The next identity, which is much more specific to Mr. Putin, is the outsider. And the reason that I've selected this picture here of Mr. Putin in judo, he really is a black belt at judo, is that from his earliest youth, Putin was very interested in the martial arts. He saw himself as a bit of a young street thug, and it was judo that, in his view, took him off the streets and gave him discipline. And throughout all of his youth, he spent all of his time with his own fraternity of judo teammates. He was actually in a very well considered national level team from Leningrad, traveling around the country competing. And it was something that meant that he didn't mix, kind of socially with lots of other people. Maybe it kept him out of trouble, but as I said, it gave him already sort of an outside persona in his view. He stresses all the time that he's an outsider. He's not from the Moscow elite. His parents weren't part of the intelligentsia. They weren't part of the Soviet nomenclatura. They weren't people who were really in the mix of things. He was an outsider even when he joined the KGB in the 1970s. I mentioned that Yuri Andropov was basically trying to recruit at that time a new group of people who were bringing some fresh thinking to think about how to dealing with the dissident movements. And when Putin was brought in the 1970s, there was basically, again, this effort to find people who weren't in the party, who weren't in the normal recruitment channels, to try to stir things up a bit again. And that was really how Putin was brought in. He was then posted outside of the Soviet Union and in Dresden in East Germany at a very critical time. He was basically posted in 1985 to Dresden. He stays there until 1990, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so in many respects, he's outside of all the major events of perestroika, of glasnost and perestroika. And you may remember that just recently, Mikhail Gorbachev, who's really not doing very well, came from his hospital bed to basically excoriate Mr. Putin and to complain about the way that he has stifled all of the developments in democracy and pluralism since the 1990s and since Gorbachev's own efforts in perestroika. Well, Putin never talks about perestroika because Putin wasn't there for really the glory days of perestroika. And Putin has a very bleak view about it because when he came back from Dresden, as I said, the main high points of glasnost and perestroika had passed, and he found the country basically on the verge of collapse. And while he's in Dresden, he has another experience of state collapse. East Germany falls apart on him. And Dresden is a very peculiar place. Renee, who's in the front row here, has written rather a lot about Eastern Europe and their kind of experiences in the late Soviet period. And Brian, Taylor knows this very well as well. Dresden was the seat of the opposition to Erich Honecker, the East German leader in this period, led by Hans Modrow, the communist leader of the local party in Dresden. Modrow was more of a liberalizer, a bit of a sympathizer toward Gorbachev, so he was constantly trying to loosen things up. And Dresden was also known at the time inside East Germany for being cut off from the rest of activity in East Germany itself. It was known as the Valley of the Clueless in Germany because it was cut off from communications. You didn't get West German television in Dresden where you did in the rest of East Germany. And in many respects, the US and others never really went there because they couldn't get their secure communications channels back to Potsdam or to Leipzig or somewhere else in the vicinity, because this was a vestige of Dresden's complete and utter destruction during World War II. So the Dresden that Mr. Putin was in was a city that had been razed to the ground, was basically the focal point of dissidence and opposition to Erich Honecker, and was also cut off from many of the things that were happening elsewhere in Germany. And his job was to work with the Stasi, the local East German secret agents, to basically keep tabs on high-tech industry from West Germany, and basically kind of keep tabs on what they were doing there. So he had a very particular job to do, and he was out of touch with what was happening at home. So when he goes back, he finds, his own country in the same state of collapse as East Germany was when he left. And when he leaves East Germany, he's also been witness to basically mob violence and to some of the clashes on the streets that didn't really take place elsewhere. And one of his last memories from East Germany is facing down a mob outside of the Stasi headquarters in Dresden. And basically the way he gets out of this mess is by telling them he's the translator and he's nobody to pay attention to, and basically makes a quick getaway. So Mr. Putin doesn't have particularly fond memories about mobs, protests, opposition movements and liberalising tendencies in this period. And when he gets back to Leningrad, which is quickly morphing into St. Petersburg, in the 1990s, he's assigned, as I mentioned before, by the KGB to work with Anatoly Sobchak, his former law professor, who becomes the mayor. And he is basically then in charge of keeping tabs, just like he was in Dresden, on businesses and figuring out what they're doing and making sure that they come through with their deals that they make with the city government. He also maybe have been in charge of stamping out the illegal activities carried out by the St. Petersburg mob in the period and making sure that the Leningrad and St. Petersburg government knew what everybody was up to. And basically, while he's there in St. Petersburg, he amasses a vast amount of compromising information on all these businesses. And in 1996, he's asked, on the basis of some of the work that he'd been doing in St. Petersburg on keeping tabs on businesses, to come to Moscow to do something similar by people he'd worked with in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. Alexei Kudryno, I mentioned earlier, and Anatoly Sobchak, one of the major reformists, in fact the key reformist after Yegor Gaidar in the Yeltsin government. And they want Mr. Putin to work with them on cleaning up house in Moscow after the Russian oligarchs have basically been picking the state apart in the wake of Yeltsin having to make a deal with them to get himself back into power in 1996. So this is the period and the circumstances in which Mr. Putin finds himself in Moscow. And then after that, as we know, he has this rather strange but meteoric rise through from the Kremlin property agency, where he first starts out looking at all of the perks and privileges that the Kremlin doles out to people in the system, to head the KGB, to then being their prime minister, to acting president. And why is that this happens? Well, a lot of it has roots in this fifth identity, the next slide here, the free marketeer, the identity that he developed when he was in St. Petersburg. This is just, kind of a tongue-in-cheek reference to Mr. Putin and the forging of a new kind of capitalism in Russia. Mr. Putin, I said, has played many different roles, and blacksmith is just one of the many. So you can find pretty much an image of Putin doing pretty much anything if you turn your mind to it. Although I haven't found one of him doing ballet yet or anything like that, but I'm sure eventually we'll find something. Anyway, Mr. Putin, as I mentioned, during the time that he was in St. Petersburg, his job was to keep tabs on Russian businesses and also joint ventures, all the foreign businesses that were setting up shop in St. Petersburg in the 1990s. He collects compromising information on them, whether they've paid their taxes or not paid their taxes, who they've been in cahoots with, perhaps in organised crime, all the various things that people have been doing in the same way that he would have done in Dresden, going to try to get leverage over them, trying to figure out how to make sure that they stick to their sides of the bargain with the St. Petersburg government. And this is a time, and this is why we call this the free marketeer, where the market capitalism in Russia is of a very specific variety. There are no institutions, there's no rule of law, everything is being reinvented from scratch. And all the people who are in business, the kinds of people who in the Soviet period were in the shadow economy. They were the people who were buying and trading in goods in the black market. And they're the people who come to the fore because they were the people who knew what they were doing. And basically, it's the wild east of Russian capitalism. So it's not one that we would think of. Mr. Putin doesn't go to business school. Mr. Putin's experience of dealing with businesses is one in which people exploited their networks, their connections to the city government, or the ties they had to other people, and they were always looking for weaknesses and leverage as a way of kind of getting ahead. So that's the kind of capitalism and view of capitalism that he brings to Moscow with him, where he's actually asked to basically clean up or help clean up the Russian oligarchs, and so that the reformers in the Yeltsin government can basically bring these guys to heel, stop them meddling in politics, and get onto the business of reform. And this leads us to the last of the identities, the case officer. And I apologise here that I really am going very hoarse, but this is the identity that we think of most as Mr. Putin, the case officer, the KGB, 15 years. We don't know exactly what he was doing in this period, but we do know that he was, very much involved, as I said, in collecting lots of information. And Putin says there are two things that he really learned from being in the KGB that have been very valuable to him. One was processing vast amounts of information, and the other was working with people, communicating with people in very many different ways. One part of that is letting people think that he's everything they want him to be, which gets back to the original guises, the political performances that Mr. Putin puts on. The other is trying to figure out how to make people do what you want them to do, recruiting them, co-opting them, blackmailing them, forcing them to do things that they don't want to do, persuading them to do things that they don't necessarily want to do and that you want them to do. And Mr. Putin again talks about how this is something that he's very proud of, that he's very good at. He's good at communicating with people, good at working with people. And that really seems to have been the way that he got himself into the position to be selected as Yeltsin's successor. He was the person that everyone wanted him to be. Everybody believed that, he was their man. And, by a certain degree of skill, and certainly by, potentially hiding his ambition and, his own intentions, he gets himself into a place where he becomes the one man standing who becomes the person to be selected as Boris Yeltsin's successor. And we've seen then throughout the whole of Putin's presidency, where he has really put all of his effort into really recruiting and mobilizing the Russian population, appealing to vast swathes of the population, and really treating everything as an operation, getting back to this title of operative in the Kremlin, to push through his particular goals, to push through his vision of where he thinks the state should be, back to being a rather conservative country domestically, a country that survives, a country that is solvent, a country that is independent, a country that's not pushed around by others. Now, clearly, we can have a lot of debates about, how Mr. Putin has got to where he has, some of the things he's done along the way. Pursuing the war in Chechnya very brutally was one of these, and we may be dealing with some of the consequences today in a very literal and real sense for us. Putin says that Chechnya, for example, was essential to putting the Russian state back together again. It was actually an FSB operation after 2002. It was the FSB, Mr. Putin's old institution, the old KGB, that was in charge of this. So it was a counterinsurgency operation, breaking the back of the Chechen militants. Putin did this because he wanted the Russian Federation to be intact again, to reverse Chechnya's move for independence. So since then, there have been an awful lot of issues that we could pick up on. And clearly, Putin has had a more difficult time recently in convincing the Russian people that he is the person who is best served now to lead them through what could be another 12 years of his presidency. While he was the Prime Minister for the last 4 years before taking the reins of the presidency again, the presidential terms were changed from 4 years to 6 years. So Mr. Putin legally, because of the Russian constitution, which is a major element in his presidency, the constitution is the main guarantor of his legitimacy, he now can legally have another 12 years at the head of the Russian state. And Putin now has to persuade the Russian people, it's a harder job than it was before for a whole variety of reasons, that he is the man who is going to continue these reforms and who is going to basically lead them into a different future. I'm going to stop there because you can hear my voice is going here, and I need to take a bit of a breath and a breather. And I never got the lovely lunch that Brian was promising me, so I'm running on fumes here. I'm running on a banana and some beans that someone gave me earlier. So if I fall face down on the table, you know what's to happen. Presumably I haven't been done in, but I'm feeling a bit exhausted right now. So over to you guys for a moment. And again, I'm really sorry that I'm not there with you in person, especially as I would have had lunch.
Thanks very much, Fiona. That was great, and I think it's
Brian, I can't hear you, I'm afraid. Can you try to turn yourself up?
Can you hear me now?
No.
What about now? I will keep talking until you can hear me.
I can just make you out, but you're very quiet. I'm a bit nervous about touching something here in case because I can hear myself now.
All right. Better than me.
Can you hear me?
Oh, hang on.
What can you hear?
I can hear you, Renee,
You
yes.
can hear me just fine? All right, well then why don't you move over here?
Okay.
And I'm gonna go over a chair.
And unfortunately, I can hear myself as well, Brian.
Well, that's not a problem.
Oh, well, okay.
Okay. Well, I think it's going to be easier for me to call on members of the audience than you because we won't know exactly who you're pointing at. So I will call on people. They will ask you questions from their seats, and you can answer from your seat. Okay.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I'd welcome people to make some comments as well. I mean, obviously, I've just sketched this out, and I do hope that people will read the book. But, you know, given where we are today with so many, you know, fast-moving events, you know, as I said, we can take this any way you'd like it to be most useful for you.
And I should put in a plug here. The bookstore, the campus bookstore, has a copy of the book, and of course, you can get it through other outlets as well. But who wants to go first? Yes, Jenny.
Hi, my name is Evgenia, I'm from Russia. So and actually, when Putin appeared, I was 18 years old, so I remember all his, he's living in Russia and all his activities that he was doing. And actually I voted for him when I was 18 years old because it was like he was only one guy in World War IV. And you were right, when he came to the power in 2000, like 99 and 2000, we, all of us were kind of, we thought that, oh yes, this is the man who is going to save us, who is going to save Russia and who is going to make our life a bright future and all these things. And it was like for several years, but then all these, like his activities, they started to change. And now, after you mentioned this opposition that appeared in 2011 and like it was going until 2012, something like this. And I have a question. What do you think? What is his future now in Russia? Like how, after his like style, idealistic style was kind of a little bit broken after this opposition and elections. So, do you think, like, what kind of future he is going to have in Russia?
No, Evgenia, I mean, it's a great question. And it was interesting as you were speaking there. I was thinking, because, you know, this week there's just been the funeral of Margaret Thatcher. And I had the same experience. I was actually younger than that when Margaret Thatcher first came into power, but my entire teenage years and my early adult life were in the UK under Margaret Thatcher, and I left in '89 because I couldn't take being in Margaret Thatcher's Britain anymore. And basically in 1990 she was removed by her party. You know, she's still the longest serving you know, British you know, kind of prime minister. Now, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I said she was removed by her party. In Britain, you know, just like in Russia, there were term limits. You know, Margaret Thatcher was also very much dependent on her political party, and it was her political party that orchestrated an internal coup, you know, to remove her through party procedures. She wasn't elected out of office. She was basically removed as being party leader. If you look at the similar situation in Russia now, Mr. Putin, just like Margaret Thatcher, is probably living beyond, you know, his political shelf life. Everyone has a political shelf life. You just alluded to that. You know, maybe basically 12 years is a very long time to be in office in any particular setting. And after a while, that political brand goes stale, even if, you know, there are ways in which the person has been effective. And in Putin's case, he's certainly presided over a period of unprecedented prosperity and stability in Russia, in spite of all the things that we know have happened, of war in Chechnya and elsewhere. Some of the things that I talked about, stabilizing the Russian economy, paying off their debt, dealing with inflation, all of those things, you know, kind of improving the tax base, you know, were major accomplishments. But Russia itself has changed really dramatically, just as the United Kingdom changed dramatically in the period that Thatcher presided over it. Russia has changed. People like you have grown to maturity. People want many different things. Putin is basically saying, when he came back into the presidency in 2012, that it's going to be nothing different. He talks, as you will remember, not about perestroika. He never mentions that. It was Medvedev who talked about a new perestroika. of a new restructuring, some kind of reform, modernization, something, completely different or possibly different. Putin talks about Dostroika, of continuing the construction that he's begun. So he's not promising anything new. And when he ran in the elections, he didn't run against anyone else. I mean, we know that the other people in the elections, Zyuganov, Prokhorov, others, were not any competition. Some of them have lost elections so many times before, we've forgotten how many times they've been there, like Zyuganov and Zhirinovsky and others. And Prokhorov wasn't really a credible alternative candidate. Even if he does on the New Jersey nets, it's not kind of not going to resonate with most of the population in Russia. So Putin was still running against the 1990s. He was basically saying, I'm the only person who can give you stability and prosperity. I'm the only guy who can do this in the future. And you talk about his future there. Now he still has the right, the legitimate right through the constitution to stay in power for 12 years. There's no one to remove him in the way that the Conservative Party in Britain removed Margaret Thatcher. He already solved the issue of term limits by stepping out into the prime ministership for 4 years, and now we can kind of come back again. So really now the kind of question is, it's all the wild card scenarios. People talk about whether there would be the equivalent of the party coup, the people around him figuring out that it's no longer working under his presidency, finding someone else from outside of that, from within that group. There's all these rumours about another Operation Successor, which is the operation. Literally, that was what it was called when people were looking for someone to replace Boris Yeltsin. People are being bandied around as potential successors to Putin from within his immediate circle. So I mean, another Mr. Putin emerging, who is basically manufactured as the leader in the way that he was 13, 14 years ago. The other wild card is his own health. Again, lots of speculations and rumours about Putin, because he's made this system so personalised now that it's all about him. And so the kind of question about, how does he leave the scene for making things to change? Because the institutions that he himself said that he was going to build up have been stripped of many of their meaning, because he himself decided he was going to come back into the presidency. I mean, he made that decision. In 2011, only too well, he said, I'm coming back. He didn't say that the Russian people want me back, and there wasn't like some kind of grassroots movement saying, come back Vladimir on the streets. I mean, it was basically him saying, I'm coming back. It's like, I'm Arnold Schwarzenegger, I'll be back, and I'm coming right now. I mean, and basically I'm using that because Putin himself uses all of these Hollywood motifs. He's the ultimate celebrity politician. And clearly he thought that everybody so universally loved him. It's like the endless Hollywood sequel. It's him, it's Bruce Willis, it's the action men who don't know that they're over 60 and they're going to break a bone if they keep on doing these kinds of things. I mean, it's basically Putin's in that same political space now of the person who doesn't know when it's time to go, because he can't. He sees himself as indispensable. He's created a system. I call it in the book the one boy network, not the old boy network, because it's all one and truly, one way or another related to Mr. Putin. Everybody has got some association with Mr. Putin and the people who make the country run. And so it's going to be very difficult to extricate that. And I don't think by any stretch of the imagination that he's won completely the round one with the opposition. We're seeing Alexei Navalny now on trial. There's, basically the opposition looks like it's being pushed back. But people in Russia want something different. There's an awful lot of grievance and dissatisfaction. And for now, it may be quiet, but it hasn't gone away anywhere. And I think, there's going to be a lot of pressures over time. And there are an awful lot of people, and I'm not going to, kind of ascribe it to you, but look, people like you who are outside of Russia in different places, who are learning different things, and who want Russia to be a normal country. And a normal country means then a country where people can have some choice and say in who governs them, and not where one man makes a decision that he's going to be back, and then we have all this speculation about succession. I mean, that's not a normal country. And I think, Russia is such now a dynamic, developed place that, things will change over time. But we now have a big question mark. I mean, we're now into the old succession politics, almost of a czarist era, where everyone's wondering who's going to replace Mr. Putin because it's all about him. And that's what you say about the political future. Putin has put basically Russia back into the place it was in the late 1990s when everyone was trying to figure out how to get beyond Boris Yeltsin. And really, over the last several years, we saw a different Russia very much emerging. More pluralism, more of people taking responsibility for themselves. And there are so many people outside of Russia now who are capable of doing something more. So, I think when we look to the next 12 years, opposition is not going to go away. And Mr. Putin is constantly going to be fighting with the very people that he needs to move the country forward into the future, the creative classes, the urban professionals, the people who want something different, the people who travel and who know that Russia is a much more dynamic, advanced place than the Russia was of the 1990s.
Great. Yes.
Hi, my name is Vanina from Georgia. First of all, thank you so much for taking your time to speak with us. I appreciate it. My question is with regards to the current happenings. I would love to hear your opinion on what do you think? How do you think the current happenings in Boston may impact the relationship between the Obama and Putin administration in certain time? And do you see that these developments might take this relationship in a different direction? What would be your response to this? Thank you.
Yeah, well, no, thanks very much for the question there. So this is about the current developments in Boston, correct? Yeah, because sometimes you broke up a little bit there, and the US-Russian relationship. You know, I mean, I guess we all, and I was in so many media calls before I came here about this, that each time we just have to be very cautious. I mean, you've probably on your laptop been picking up information, you know, that since I've been in here, you know, in the last hour or so that I don't really know about. We know a little bit about the two people. At least when I came in, you know, there was more information coming out. The person who is still being sought, maybe he's been, you know, kind of captured in this time, spending most of his life in Boston, going a student at Cambridge Ringe and Latin. Renee, Brian, and I know all of this, you know, very well. This is our old stomping grounds there, and you know, basically, the Chechen phenomenon inside of Russia, as I mentioned, is a very particular one. You probably know it personally, you know, very well too. We don't know yet how much that played into the decision of these young men to basically carry out this atrocious act in Boston. As I was coming into the room, my research assistant Hannah, who was with me, that's who I was waving bye to when I came in, had told me that information had been coming out in Kontakte through, you know, the Russian Facebook and social media sites, that the older brother who was killed in the shootout with the police had gone back to Russia sometime in the last year and had apparently come back changed. I mean, that follows a lot of the patterns that we see in radicalisation in many other settings. Remember the London tube bombings? Those were also, I mean, people who grew up in the UK, they were British citizens. Some of them had gone back to Pakistan. And, you know, people talked about them being changed after those kinds of experiences. Look, we don't really know exactly what's happening yet, but Chechnya has faded from the newspapers in the United States. It's going to be right back there again. In the 1990s and the 2000s, we were fixated on Chechnya like we were in Bosnia and the Balkans before that, just as we are in Syria now. It was a terrible conflict. It started off as a secessionist independence movement, very political. Zhoka Dudayev, the first name of the guy that they're looking for now is Zhoka. I mean, you've got to think that his parents may have had Zhoka Dudayev in mind when he was named. Zhoka Dudayev was the first leader of an independent or self-acclaimed independent Chechnya in the 1990s. He was a highly decorated Soviet war veteran. He'd fought in Afghanistan. He'd been in the Soviet military, a commander. He was secular. But he was basically believed that Chechnya had a whole history of persecution and injustice at the hands of the Russian dating back to the imperial period. We know there are hundreds of years of Chechen and other North Caucasian peoples' insurgency and rebellion against the Russian Empire. Georgia, you know, various times was embroiled in this as the Russian Empire tried to consolidate its hold in the Caucasus. In the contemporary period, in the 1940s, Stalin deported the Chechens, along with a whole host of other groups, Crimean Tatars, many others, into Central Asia, basically accusing them of collaboration with the Nazis, being on the frontier of Russia and the Soviet Union. It seems that there's some linkages of the family to Kyrgyzstan, and that's where, of course, a lot of the Chechens who were deported to Central Asia ended up in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. I mean, again, we don't know all the details here, but that diaspora of Chechens in Central Asia has been radicalized before. There were Chechens from Central Asia, from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, who ended up actually fighting with the Taliban in Afghanistan and ended up in Waziristan. I mean, this is not to say that there's direct linkage with these young men here, but let's just say that there's a whole pattern of radicalization here. And the Chechen war that broke out in the 1990s after Boris Yeltsin in 1994 sent Russian troops into Chechnya to suppress Dudayev's independence drive. Over time, that civil war, that war morphed, as we saw in Syria, not quite as quickly as in Syria, but pretty quickly, into something else. It went from being an opposition, more secular political movement of, basically the political independence of a state that was pulling in all kinds of people from different backgrounds of the people who were living in Chechnya. And remember, there was an awful lot of ethnic Russians killed there because Grozny, the capital city of Chechnya, was as much a Russian city as anything else. And that city was razed to the ground in the 1990s. And then again, when the war broke out after a brief peace treaty in the late 1990s, that's when Putin comes into power. And that second war is known as Putin's war inside of Russia. You're probably well aware of that because it was Putin who presided over that war. He didn't begin it. It was basically, again, the last of the fling of the Yeltsin government. But he comes into power against the backdrop of the apartment bombings, Chechen militants moving into Dagestan, again, another republic that's being linked today to the family with Makhachkala, the capital of Dagestan, apparently having some ties to the family. Dagestan is now one of the most radicalized republics of Russia. There's insurgency going on there all the time. There are raids by the Russian services on militant groups in Makhachkala and elsewhere on a regular basis. I mean, basically that's become one of the hotbeds of radical activity inside of Russia. Doesn't mean to say the whole population is radicalized, but that's been a direct consequence of the groups moving into Chechnya. Ramzan Kadyrov and his father, Ahmed Kadyrov, before him, put a bit of brutal suppression of the opposition movement in Chechnya. They've turned Chechnya, as you well know, into a rather strange, quasi-independent, quasi-Muslim, quasi-Chechen state of a really kind of fanciful concoction that Kadyrov has made of it. And they've now rebuilt it as a showcase of a kind of a new, kind of modern North Caucasus, but the violence has not gone away. And so we don't really know, how much that shaped the ideas of, the two young men in Boston. How will it feed now into US-Russian relations? Well, it's always been a thorn in the relationship in the past, from the 1990s to the 2000s. The US wanted the Russian government to basically negotiate with the Chechen opposition. The Russian government always refused, especially under Putin. I mean, in the Yeltsin era, they did negotiate and actually have a peace treaty. Putin said that wasn't going to happen. There was going to be no suing for peace. And he was going to basically, you remember infamously words about, he said it very rudely in Russian, but take the bandits out in their outhouses. You probably remember the Russian phrase, a bit different, and indeed he did. He's taken them out wherever he could get them. The head of the former acting president of Chechnya, Yan Durbiev, was blown up in a car bomb in 2004 in Qatar. And we know it was the Russians because the operatives who did that were captured by the Qatari authorities. So basically there's been the assassination of opposition figures, the pulverization again of Chechnya, and Putin never sued for peace. Ramzan Kadyrov and his father basically turned away from the opposition. They basically declared their loyalty to Moscow. Very different, kind of situation from before. But Putin has always said that Chechnya has been part of this whole broader struggle against terrorism. When 9/11 happened and Putin reached out to the United States to help in Afghanistan, he expected that the US would stop complaining about what was happening in Chechnya. The US didn't. And Putin was always trying to make the point that Chechnya was part of that broader base of terrorism. I'm sure he'll be making that again. I'm sure Mr. Kadyrov will be as well. And basically the question now will be whether there are any linkages back to Chechnya itself, and whether we will revive the discussions that we used to have about terrorism in Chechnya, and whether there can be some kind of basis here for a sensible discussion about it. But it's a very difficult and very sensitive issue, and right now we don't really know, whether the young men were motivated in part by what we've seen there, or by senses of injustice elsewhere. And clearly the act that they carried out was here. But there's been lots of acts of terrorism carried out by Chechens in Russia. And there have been actually outside of Chechnya incidences and outside of Russia before in Turkey. But this is obviously the first time that anything like this has basically happened. So, I guess we'll be talking about this for quite some time to come.
Yes.
Thanks very much for the fascinating, but importantly, very comprehensive, very detailed presentation of who Putin is an operative under 4 categories. with which we should understand them. Now, from your presentation, however, there is the implication and the impression that perhaps the way you presented him, Putin is really larger than life. So it's perhaps impossible to capture him without any one of our conceptual cognitive networks, because he's constantly evolving, adapting, reinventing himself, contingent upon the situation he faces. So then the question is he going to stay within the international rules, or is he going to go to the dark side the way he did with Chechnya? Because after all, Chechnya had nothing to offer to Russia in terms of any kind of resources, but nonetheless, with a great cost of his country, he went the complete route of suppressing them. So the question is, how do you respond to the two aspects of the question asked? One, that he's unpredictable because he's constantly changing and evolving. And second one is, like Stalin, will he go towards the dark side at some point?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually in many respects, why we wrote the book, because we know so little about the real facets of Mr. Putin's biography, which is why he seems so unpredictable and why he, kind of can basically tailor himself, including putting on, these ridiculous at times costumes to be, something else. Why he can plausibly appear as a firefighter in an aircraft we don't really know whether he flies. I mean, it looked like he did. Where he can be a deep sea diver, though on that one we know he didn't dive very far. But remember when he pulls up the amphora from the bottom of the back sea, apparently he only dove down 10 feet. But in any case, in many other cases, he presents himself in these outlandish settings because it's entirely plausible he can be that, because we know so little about him. So that's why we tried to home in on what we could figure out about Putin from the context. And that's where, the idea of the operative becomes very important, because that responds to your second question here. There's something more predictable about that than one would imagine. Putin is someone for whom there are different kinds of rules. He's very unusual in being a leader right now, a leader in an international setting. Apart from Putin, there's only really one other contemporary leader who is now deceased, who comes from a similar kind of background, and that was Heydar Aliyev, who had been, very senior in the KGB, who became the president of Azerbaijan, first president of Azerbaijan, independent Azerbaijan. But Heydar Aliyev had also been more of a public figure because he was in the Politburo in the Soviet period, so people knew who he was. It wasn't like Putin, who came from, as Masha Gessen and others have said, essentially from nowhere. He was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, but that's the first time that, many people can even recall meeting him. And the interesting thing about his time in St. Petersburg is many people who met him then could never remember him. When we were doing a lot of interviews, one of our Russian colleagues, Pavel Bayev, called Putin the man who could disappear in a crowd of two. Because in every case, people would say, well, I think Putin was there, but I can't remember, I just can't get a grip on him. You think that was Putin, but who knows? Renee and Brian and I were all at the Kennedy School in the 1990s, and we worked on all these technical assistant projects. And Sobchak came to the Kennedy School. We have no idea whether Putin was there or not. We don't think he was, but no one can remember. And no one can remember in setting that up whether they met with Putin or they didn't. And I was constantly going back through all files going, was he, wasn't he? That's the kind of person Putin is. He's deliberately, until he vaults to the national stage, and then he's more, present and photographed than any other human being on the planet practically. He's a man behind the scenes, and that he's still got the mentality of a clandestine, a covert operative. And so that means that he operates by different rules. For Mr. Putin, anything is permissible if it's in pursuit of the operation of the success of the goal. So when you say, can he go towards the dark side, that's where he's from. And I mean, basically, we've seen many times, he's been accused of so many things. Well, he's a man who took part in operations. He's a man who bribed people, blackmailed people, used all kinds of compromising information to basically get them to do certain things in pursuit of a goal. So when Putin looks at the Russian state, he thinks things are absolutely necessary. And he has said quite openly on things like Chechnya, for example, that he would do whatever it takes to make sure that Chechnya was back in the Russian Federation, and he did. And he also comes from that background that I mentioned of this survivalist, of a family who went through terrible sacrifice, individual sacrifice, collective sacrifice. So those kinds of sacrifices for him are just, basically part of the whole situation. That's why it's very difficult to deal with Putin on Syria and on a host of other things, because he has a very different perspective. And that's what I say, he's more predictable in those respects, because he's really very much, kind of the product of an environment in which you conducted an operation and you did whatever was necessary to make that operation happen.
Yes, Rob.
How did it happen that Putin became Yeltsin's successor? What forces, what particularly went on, particularly the age of Yeltsin, in leading to that?
Yeah, I'll be honest about that we don't have any particular insight into this. And we said right at the very beginning of the book that we wouldn't be able to solve that mystery, because there's an awful lot right now of, sort of self-serving after the fact, memoirs, basically. Boris Yeltsin in Midnight Diaries talks about it. Boris Berezovsky, has multiply said, of course, he recently committed suicide or was bumped off, depending on one's perspective here. He said he was responsible for this. People like Anatoly Chubaisev have said, no, we weren't responsible, though we kind of brought him here, we never expected this to happen. There's an awful lot of speculation about this, and a lot of people taking credit or disavowing credit for Putin being in the right place at the right time. So we basically tried to talk about the kinds of circumstances in which, kind of emerged. So he was brought to Moscow in someone else's operation, to be an operative, to be an outsider, to be someone who was working with people he'd worked with before, to basically help them clean up shop. And then he ends up being the boss. So he, by his own skill set, by his ability to work with people and process information, he manages to get himself into that spot, and then, he's chosen. And everybody thought at the time that they would be able to run him. There is so much, if you go back into the record, it's all in the press. It's very easy to go back and see what people were saying at the time. They underestimated him. So he's when you're an operative, and that's what's, the kind of why we played on this in the title, you're usually being run by someone else. Putin runs himself. And it's very clear that that's kind of what's happened. Whoever selected him, whoever thought he would be their man, whoever, kind of decided that he would be the guy to protect the Yeltsin family, to make sure that Yeltsin, nothing would happen to him when he stepped away from the presidency, and who was going to ensure the progress of reforms, as Chubais, Kudrin and others thought, and many of them have stuck by him all the way through. He obviously turned out to be something somewhat different and very much his own man. Now, Steve Lee Myers from the New York Times is one of the journalists and used to be the bureau chief of the New York Times, is writing a book about Putin right now, a biography, and he's going to try to get to the bottom of this. Masha Gessen's book, she also, doesn't really come to the bottom of, how he was selected. And as I said, there's lots of material out there by the people purporting to have a hand in it. We'll see what Steve Lee Myers comes up with, but it may be that we'll never know until Putin has, passed the scene. Then, years have passed as to the real circumstances of this. Because, unless you were right there at the time recording this, you'll never really know about what happened. So we say that right at the front of the book, that we'll try to at least explain why Putin could be selected, the kind of person that he turned out to be, the context, but we don't know the specific circumstances.
You mentioned how Putin has adopted many different personas. I'm wondering if that in itself is a direct allusion to Peter the Great. I mean, the reformist carpenter czar. As Putin definitely has tried to raise Russia's profile in the world and to present it again as a great power after the supposed humiliations of the Yeltsin era.
These are all great questions, by the way, and I think, you've raised another really interesting aspect here. I mean, Putin has really, in many respects, although, he's certainly picked up on key personages from the Soviet era, his real body of inspiration has come from the Tsarist era. And Peter the Great is obviously up there with the pantheon of the leaders that he likes to associate with himself, especially given the fact that Peter the Great was the founder of St. Petersburg, Putin's own city, that he often likes to bemoan the fact that it was downgraded as being the imperial capital, in the Soviet period. And it's certainly the case that he has picked up just as you put out there, the idea of Peter the Great, the carpenter, the shipbuilder, I mean, I guess, kind of the image of, Putin forging at the anvil there. We could probably have seen Peter the Great doing the same if he'd had a good photographer, back in the day. It was Peter the Great who made the empire, who forged it, who created the fleet, all of this. I mean, basically, picking up on those Tsarist images of being the conqueror, the great creator, this is very much the traditional imagery. Max Weber talks about legitimacy and there being multiple elements of legitimacy, and one of that is stressing tradition as well as charisma, communing with the people, getting yourself the acclaim of popular acclaim, the acclaim of the population. And when you look at the imagery of the Tsars, Putin's photographs emulate that in many respects. Peter the Great on horseback, Putin the Great on horseback, Putin and the gun, Peter the Great and the sword. All of these kinds of pictures of Tsars on horseback, Tsars doing adventurous things, Tsars in incredible settings that stress the great grandeur, the natural beauty of Russia. Putin's always, there's actually a very interesting article done by a British geographer about Putin and geography. All the pictures of places that Putin has gone, there are always these dramatic backdrops, where he's tranquilizing a tiger, shooting a whale, or, kind of swimming in, Siberian lakes and rivers. There's just this dramatic setting that really kind of gets across this greatness of Russia, this incredible natural heritage, and the Tsars did that as well. The whole Potemkin village phenomenon, the infamous period of Catherine the Great, where General Potemkin goes out and makes sure that the farthest reaches of the Russian Empire that have just been settled and conquered look like they're now, prosperous. Putin's always going off to villages in far-flung areas that are not Potemkin villages, but maybe have been established in Potemkin and Catherine the Great era, to basically make the point that he's there, he's everywhere, he's in all of these places on the frontiers. So Putin is very much, probably from all of his reading of these biographies of the Tsars, he's very into the iconography of being the president. And in many respects, he's called now the Tsar, and just, the kind of the inside jokes in the Kremlin and elsewhere. Sometime in 2011, the references to Putin inside the Kremlin seem to have shifted. It used to be called the Nachalnik, the boss, which had a very Soviet connotation. And then he's recently been called the Tsar. So that's the one identity that, perhaps, we could have made more of within the book. We reference it, but, obviously that's another identity that one could have teased out. And I think, that question, really, puts the finger on one of the things that Putin, celebrity politician, but also one in a very identifiable Russian tradition.
Yes, you refer to Putin's identity with Russian history. You talked about that. And of course, part of that history is Russian expansionism. And as someone with a Polish background, I'm always sensitive to Russian expansionism. So what is Putin's international, his ambitions at an international level in terms of his interest in expanding Russian interests, say the Middle East or wherever?
Putin is obviously very concerned about Russia's international profile. It's interesting that you mentioned that you're of a Polish background. I mean, obviously one of the elements of Russian imperial creation was the partitions of Poland, the multiple partitions of Poland. You know it only too well, and I'm sure, lived that as a young person, of Polish heritage. Putin has actually, spent an awful lot of time about, really projecting that, vision of strength, of being a really strong leader domestically onto an international stage. He's very concerned about his international image, and in that line of rather be feared, than loved, and that's kind of part of the whole persona of getting respect. So this very image of Putin as kind of like the bad guy, the tough guy, is one that he relishes on the international stage as well, because people are taking Russia seriously because they're taking Putin seriously, and people are a bit frightened of Putin. And then obviously that kind of resonates at home as well. It's part of the the reason why Putin has been quite popular on the constituency that's continued to support him. He doesn't, however, also shy away from making different kinds of gestures if necessary, and Poland is another interesting one. Poland, as you well know, I mean, with this very dramatic history with Russia, had a very nasty history with Russia during World War II. And Putin has actually grappled with that in a way that one might not have expected. On the one hand, the Russian National Day is actually the day that the Polish invading forces during the times of troubles in the 17th century were repelled from Moscow. But at the same time, Putin has tried to address the real black spots in more contemporary Russian-Polish relations by being the person who acknowledged Katyn, basically the massacre by the Soviet secret services, not by the Nazis as it was claimed for a long time, but even by Putin himself for a very long time during World War II. This is when for those of you who are not familiar with that, the Polish officer corps were basically shot, assassinated and buried in a mass grave in the Katyn forest. And this was, of course, marking the anniversary of that, the occasion of the terrible tragedy of the downing of the Polish aircraft carrying the president and many of the 96 of the most senior members of the Polish government and armed forces to the memorial of Katyn when their plane went down in bad weather over Smolensk. And it's been Putin actually who reached out to the Polish government to try to resolve the continued difficulties over Katyn, although obviously the plane crash has created even more kinds of acrimony because the Russian government has never been completely transparent on the findings behind the crash. But Putin basically personally endorsed the showing of Andrzej Wajda's famous movie on Katyn on Russian public television. He went and laid wreaths and made apologies in many respects for this. Now, the question is, why did he do that? Of course, because Mr. Putin, this is not just all done out of some sympathy. It's done for a purpose. It's part of an operation, and this was kind of operation win over the Poles because Russia was trying to basically improve its relations with the major leading powers of the European Union. And Poland, of course, has been a leading power within the European Union. This was the time when the Polish presidency of the EU was underway. And Putin is very concerned, obviously, about the EU and Russia's standing with the EU. The relations with Germany, actually, they've taken a turn for the worse recently, but, were a big priority for him. And he made Poland another priority for improving relations. He made that a personal project. So Putin operates in that way internationally, too. He makes things personal projects. And he does personal engagement. He doesn't really deal, with large groups of people and societal dynamics. He deals with individuals, or he deals with individual issues. And Poland has been one of those that he's used on the international stage to, create something of a different image. Again, appearing in many different guises to different people.
Thank you, Fiona. This was very rich and quite interesting. And just building on sort of Putin's reflecting back on the czars, maybe that explains the palatial house that was attributed to him back in 2011, a couple of years ago. He needed his own palace. But the question that I wanted to ask is more about the future and where he sees things going, because when Medvedev came in as president, there was sort of this question of whether Medvedev was going to be the successor. But now it's, at least to someone like me, very unclear what Putin thinks will follow him and whether he has any sense of building a party or a political institution that moves the country toward normalcy. And so I wonder if you see that as a concern either of his or of the people around him who might want to replace him.
Yeah, I think that really is a big concern of people around Putin. Putin himself, this is the question that people keep asking him. When I was at one of these infamous Valdai discussion club meetings, there's a picture of me on the internet sitting next to Putin at dinner, I asked him this very question. I said, what do you want your legacy to be? What do you want Russia to look like after you've gone? And he said, don't bury me yet. And he was very close, so he was like, don't bury me yet, in my face. And I was like, oops. And then, of course, I had to make the fatuous comment that, it looked in pretty good health to me, but, I'd still like to know the answer to the question, he doesn't want to answer that question because, I think in many respects, he doesn't really know. Putin is a really great tactician. He clearly has an idea that he's putting Russia back on its feet on a number of issues, domestically, prosperity, stability, Russia able to fend for itself internationally. I mean, these all sound pretty vague because in many respects they are. You know, he's kind of described them in these very general terms. He's never really talked about the methods in which he is going to achieve, you know, Russia as one of the big players or maintain Russia's position there. He's talked about Russia in this traditional sense, a very conservative vision of Russia, one in which the Orthodox Church is kind of the main social glue, although he's also talked variously and most recently too of the importance of other indigenous, you know, religions, Russia's own indigenous Islam, which of course the Chechens are a part of, Russia's indigenous Jewish heritage, its Jewish populations, and as we know in the imperial period there were many Jewish sects, Hasidism and many others that emerged out of the shtetls of Eastern Europe and the Russian Pale of Settlement, and Putin has been very much focused on putting back that heritage as well, often to the consternation of Jewish groups here in the United States and elsewhere who would like the artifacts from that period given to them, and Putin's saying they're not yours, they're ours, they're part of Russian heritage, because if you want them, come back here, because this is all part of the fabric of the Russia. He's almost trying to recreate in many respects this multi-ethnic, multicultural, everything to everybody Russia, kind of it's a Russia of his imagination and other people's imagination here rather than a Russia of reality. Again, it's a conservative Russia in many respects, the old Tsarist Russia of orthodoxy, autocracy, and the people. And you know, the people obviously is a sort of changing, flexible concept, even in Putin's mind. He's now creating, on the subject of institutional invention, the People's Front. Just picking up on this idea of the people, which is something that you know only too well from the Eastern European context. I mean, this is something that East Germans, you know, came up with, of a way of mobilizing society, various groups, not just political parties, behind the person of the leader. The one institution that Putin has focused on the most has been the presidency and on the Russian constitution. So in terms of institutional legacy, he's going to leave behind a strengthened 1996 constitution that was drafted in part by Anatoly Sobchak, his old law professor. And for all that Sobchak seemed to be a Democrat and, you know, was known for being, you know, rather pluralistic in his approach as mayor of St. Petersburg, Sobchak was very conservative when it came to the law. And Sobchak was one of a body of legal scholars who looked back to the legal scholars of the 19th century in Russia who were trying to create a constitutional monarchy. And in many respects, the 1996 Russian constitution was turning the Russian president into a constitutional monarch. And another of the drafters of that constitution, Sergei Shakrai, who actually you might remember personally, because he did come to Harvard, we remember him, he actually said that the only model, if there was a foreign model for the Russian presidency, was the British monarch, the Queen of England. It was actually the Russian president has a hell of a lot more power than the Queen of England, but nonetheless you get the drift, the idea of a constitutional monarch. So the president in that conception is supposed to be above politics, above parties, and Putin has famously said that the president, Putin, should not be part of a party. The People's Front is something, you know, completely different. And that's, of course, the Yeltsin era model too, particularly after 1996. And the constitution, the whole idea that, it's 1993 constitution, but after the whole kind of elections, the whole idea was that the president wasn't part of politics, that there would be these social movements that could represent and support the president, but that the so-called ruling party, the president wasn't really part of that. And you can see now that United Russia, which was seen as the dominant ruling party in the last several years, has fallen out of favour. It was the source of the electoral protests in 2011 after the Russian Duma. It's now clearly fallen out of favour. Dmitry Medvedev has been saddled with the responsibility for that. You know, remember he was put in charge of the party when Putin said he was coming back into the presidency. So basically, Putin has really focused everything down on these two institutional arrangements, the presidency and the constitution, which are obviously self-reinforcing. And he hasn't really built up any other institution. So his legacy is going to be really a hyper-strengthened presidency that he has made really basically the personal patrimony of one man by basically saying he was coming back into it, making it much more likely that there will be an operation to find someone just like him, another Mr. Putin, to warm that seat, rather than a full institutional process which will bring in all of the Russian electorate to have their say in how this takes shape. He will basically leave behind a legacy of otherwise emasculated institutions, including the prime ministership, because look at his treatment now of Dmitry Medvedev, that he said he was going to strengthen when he went in to become prime minister. He was going to boost the governance, and now he's talking about sacking the government, sacking the cabinet, sacking the prime minister in leaked videos, out to the press. So he's undermining that. And basically an establishment, a one-boy network that looks more czarist than anything else, because there is no broader institution that's going to be able to move the country forward. The only good thing is that those institutions still exist. There still is a parliament, there's still a cabinet of ministers, there are still institutions at the regional level. And in many respects, there's a very vibrant society out there of a Russia that's getting on with itself in spite of what's happening here in Moscow. I mean, he will leave, again, a legacy of a solvent country, and one in which certainly over the last 12 years has really matured, and an awful lot of people have been taking matters into their own hands. But of course, what we're seeing now is him reacting against that, in many respects trying to suppress a lot of that grassroots activity that has now manifested itself at the political level. Putin made a kind of a eulogy to Margaret Thatcher recently, somebody else with a very fraught and contested legacy, and almost it seemed like he was eulogizing himself when he was asked to give his comment on her. He said, she was a person who did the tough things when the tough things were required, and it didn't care whether she was liked or not. And I think that Putin would say, basically the same things about himself. He thinks he's taking the tough decisions. He thinks he's putting Russia on the right track, but his legacy is going to be one that's going to be really, I think, questioned for an awfully long time. Had he made a different decision in September 2011, had he decided to continue with some form of the tandem, but with him not as the president, I think we'd be talking about something very different. I think we'd be talking about much more institutionalized, perhaps even an opening out of the system. But because of the nature of the system that he created, based on this compromise, this kind of legacy of intrigue, he obviously didn't feel, and maybe those around him didn't feel, that he could dismantle it. So it's going to be a very tough challenge ahead to put this particular political system on a different track.
Fiona, do you have the stamina for one or two more questions?
Almost. I'm actually sort of flagging a little bit here. I need something to eat. Unfortunately, I'm in a blank room, with panels on all sides. I was trying to, I haven't got a tie or something that I can eat, or a piece of paper to nibble on, but as I said, I'm feeling a bit faint. A yogurt and a banana at 7 o'clock this morning are kind of running out now. But if there's something else, I'm still here.
Let's do at least one more. Yeah, Aaron had a question.
First of all, thank you for the patience and energy you're giving in here. So my question is about energy politics. I'm not sure how much your work actually deals with energy politics, but I'm curious what you think about the future Russian prospects in light of the shale revolution and liquid natural gas. Specifically, I see these things greatly affecting kind of the power hand that Russia has, certainly with the EU. But I'm really more curious how you think this affects Putin and his future as a politician, especially as him being a politician who scored a lot of points by getting the oligarchs in line and using the money made from taxing Gazprom and Rosneft.
That's a great question. Actually, I spent a lot of time working on this as well with Clifford Gaddy, and this is one of the aspects that we talk about in the book. And I have to actually commend Cliff, along with Barry Ickes, a professor at Penn State University. I've got a couple of articles and a book out. You won't be able to afford the book, unfortunately, because it's one of these classic academic textbooks priced at $150, kind of a book. But it's a book called Bear Traps on Russia's Road to Modernization, where they really kind of get into this whole nexus between the energy and the rents from energy across the whole of the Russian economy, and what the prospects are for Russian modernizing over time. They have another article in one of the kind of encyclopedias on Russia's dependency on oil and gas resources. These are just kind of, if you want to read more about this, there's some really interesting stuff that's out there. And Thane Gustafson at Georgetown has a big book on Russian energy and the future. But basically, in a nutshell here, the Russian government is scrambling around trying to figure out and recalculating the future based on the shale revolution, in the United States, because this definitely has changed the calculations. Oil and gas revenues remain the mainstay of the domestic economy, and they are, very much at the root of all of the promises that Putin made during the elections to pay for this, pay for that, and pay for the other. Well, they can't pay for that unless, kind of oil and gas prices remain high. And gas is no longer indexed to oil, thanks to the breakthroughs in shale, as you well know, and oil prices are no longer at the heights that they were. Collapse of the Soviet Union comes about when oil is at $10 a barrel. The height of, kind of Russia's economic growth comes when they're at $150 a barrel in 2008, which is also the sort of the height of, the kind of the whole era for Putin, affecting the handoff to Medvedev, thinking that Russia is in just a much better place. And of course, then we get the economic crisis and the rest is history sort of thing. So the problem that they have now is that they have basically devised budgets that only balance at around $120 a barrel, much higher than it ever used to be before. At times in the past, it was at $60 a barrel, so they've doubled that in terms of the expectation. And oil is now around 100. It's not anywhere near 10 and is not likely to be. But any kind of sustained low oil price like this, for several years will put the Russian budget in big trouble. And that will put Mr. Putin in trouble. And that gets back, to the last set of questions about the future. Because the protests in Russia have been political so far, they haven't been economic. And the biggest fear for Putin and the people around him is this problem of maintaining the oil and gas revenues, the rent distributions and flows throughout the whole of the Russian economy. And when that starts to shrink, it was not going to dry up, but it's going to become much more difficult to fulfill promises. So then when you get people on the street with economic grievances, that's when you've got real big trouble. The last time that people were out in the streets protesting before those elections was the pensioners, when the Russian government made the retrospectively disastrous decision to monetize people's pensions benefits. And it takes a lot to get old Russian ladies out protesting in the streets, but they managed to do it. And obviously another collapse in the Russian economy, or a relative collapse, because Putin has been very careful to make sure it never goes back to where it was in the 1990s, but everything is relative. And when you have much higher expectations and they're not met, you then have another base for further grievances. So that may also explain why he's coming down so hard now on Navalny and all of the other political opposition, in the fear and expectation that as we move on, it's going to be more difficult for Russia to maintain its dominant position in global energy markets. And gas is not going to be as lucrative for the Russian government as a source of revenues as it used to be. Even if Russia maintains, a major market share in Europe, there's going to be much more competition and much more uncertainty over the next several years. So Putin knows that this is a big issue and they're watching it very closely. And again, it's when those protests that are political start to fuse with economic grievances that are in the whole sweep of Russia's past, that's when things become most dangerous. For the regime, that is, yeah.
All right, I think we should let Fiona have a very late lunch after spending a great deal of time with us here today. So I just want to thank you on behalf of us all again. I'm sorry we weren't able to host you here in Syracuse in person, but perhaps at some point in the future we will meet you in Maxfield School in person and see you then. Okay?
I'd love to try to come back again in the fall, hopefully with no thunderstorms and winds. Is it really that bad out there? It's not too good, yeah.
Anyway, I hope it's calmed
No,
down
no.
because I'm supposed to fly out this afternoon.
You're inside, because it would be terrible if you walk out of here and it's blazing sunshine and, people are sunbathing, outside on the grass. So anyway, but nonetheless, I mean, at least I could be with you across the airwaves, even if not in person. And, I'm really grateful to people showing up, even if I wasn't really there. It's just the virtual me.
You was very good, so thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone.